Democrats continue to focus on the jobs they say have already been created through the Recovery Act and other measures. But in an exclusive MSNBC interview with Chuck Todd, the president was surprisingly blunt when he was asked to speak to out-of-work Americans.
What do you tell the person who may have voted for you, can't find a job or got laid off since you took office, why they should still keep the Democrats in charge because they're not feeling any of the positive yet?
Look, if somebody's out of work right now, the only answer that I'm going to have for them is when they get a job. Up until that point, from their perspective, the economic policies aren't working well enough.
You're okay if they hold you accountable?
Look,
they can't find a job.
That's my job as president is to take responsibility for moving us in the right direction. But what I'm absolutely convinced of is that we're going to have a choice, not just in November, but for years to come.
Cenk Uygur is host of the online show The Young Turks and is also a blogger. Good afternoon.
Hey there, how are you, Chris?
I'm curious what you thought about that exchange between Chuck and the president.
You know, of course he has to say that, and of course he's partly responsible, and some of his decisions, I think, actually have been the wrong ones when it comes to giving the bailout money to the banks, where they're just holding it and not sharing it with the rest of the businesses in the country and not providing capital. At the same time, I think it's also right to remind everybody the reason we're in this mess is because of the Republicans. So, you know, if you're an American voter, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. We haven't really gotten out of the recession yet, but on the other hand, the guys who caused it is the opposition party. So
let's say we accept that premise, and you also look at the fact, as the president's supporters would say, that he has had an extraordinary record in pushing through a lot of really tough legislation, even though the Congress obviously is controlled by his party. The Recovery Act, health care, now financial reform. And yet there's this disconnect because when you look at the polls, you can see how unhappy the American people are. Do you think it's that the White House PR machine isn't doing its job? Maybe he should have picked something to push through that had results that were a little more immediate that he could point to? What do you think's going on here?
You know, I got to be honest with you. I think it's almost the exact opposite. I think the White House PR machine has been doing a fantastic job. Hey, look at us. We did overwhelming health care reform, the greatest financial reform since the Great Depression. But the reality is much more slim pickings. Look, here's what's the stimulus package was good, but that alone isn't going to get the job done. The reason they need to do reform much bigger and much earlier is because the banks are keeping all the taxpayer money. They got so much indirectly, and they're not lending it out. If the private industry does not lend out the money, then the businesses aren't going to recover, and we're going to continue to have unemployment. That was the big mistake Bush made. That's the big mistake that Obama's continued to make. And so, you know, I think he's got himself to blame for that. That's why unemployment hasn't gone back down yet.
Okay, and so as we look ahead again to November, let me play for you what Mitch McConnell had to say about what he thinks about Republican chances. Take a listen.
And those Republicans in Washington, the ones who were supposed to be beaten down, demoralized, and despondent, well, we were listening. We broke out of the Washington echo chamber and fought the government-driven solutions the Democrats were proposing. In short, you might say we got our groove back.
Too much big business. Is that the right sort of theme for them to be hammering from now until the elections?
Again, we run into the same problem. You know, if you don't like the economic policies of Tim Geithner and Larry Summers, and that's the direction Obama's gone, then you turn to the Republicans, and boy, are they so much worse. I mean, look at the story you showed earlier about John Boehner. It says no more regulation. The deregulation is what caused the economic collapse in the first place. You go to Mitch McConnell, and he's ecstatic about protecting the biggest bankers in the country. So if you go to the Republicans, you're in worse shape. They promise that they're going to make sure that the banks keep gambling with our money and that they don't actually lending out to the real businesses all across the country.
Cenk, thanks so much. It's good to see you.